I think that the ruling elite sees the handwriting on the walls, and I think they're gearing up for something like martial law. Nobody knows when this is going to happen, but it seems to me clear the U.S. economy is getting worse and worse and worse. The mainstream media paints a different picture. They try to tell us things are pretty good. They want to keep us conned into continue to spend and go into debt further and further. But the government is really sort of tightening the noose around our necks in more and more ways.
As a responsible person with growing concerns for your privacy and personal liberty, you want to know where we're headed and what you can do about it. We ask the experts what you need to do to take prudent and responsible action to safeguard your family's wealth and well-being, and what basic first steps will help you to be aware and prepared. ReluctantPreppers.com.
Welcome back, Reluctant Preppers. Today our special guest is Jay Taylor, founder of Turning Hard Times into Good Times radio channel, as well as the Jay Taylor's Golden Technology Stocks newsletter, and he can be found online at jtaylormedia.com. Welcome to our show, Jay.
Really good to be with you, Donegan.
Now, you if you could just talk to us just for a few minutes so people know who you are as far as your radio channel and other activities that you do, and the types of people that you interact with and the experts that you interface with on a weekly basis.
Sure. Well, a little about my background. I'm a little older than you, Donegan. I was actually born in 1947, so I remember the time when the United States still had a gold-backed system of sorts. And a time when life was quite different in the United States. I grew up in a rural farming area in Ohio. Parents that were fairly religious Mennonite people. They were capitalists, but they believed very, very strongly in a supreme being, in a God that controls the universe. So that's, I think, had a lot to do with the way I viewed the world. But in 1967, I was a sophomore at a small Mennonite college in Kansas called Heston College, and I had a professor there named Dr. Peyton Yoder, who was absolutely convinced that there was a correlation between the debasing of a nation's currency and its work ethic and its morality in general. And I thought that was a very interesting concept. So I started to, I think if there was one thing and one professor that influenced the direction of my life from that point on, it was Dr. Peyton Yoder back in 1967, because I started watching and thought a lot about that concept, and then watched what took place later in the later part of the 60s and into the 70s. And there certainly was a revolution of sorts that took place in the United States away from traditional values towards new ways of looking at things that were, I would say, more typical of the way most people around the world view government and life in general, at least in the Western world. And so I started watching what was going on. I as a Mennonite, was brought up as, at that time at least, the Mennonites were not in favor of going to war. They believed it was wrong to kill people under any circumstance. They did not adopt the Augustinian concept of a just war, which I believe now makes sense and am in agreement with. But at least at that time, I served then my country by working in a hospital. I had the alternative of doing that. Our government was good enough to allow those with a conscientious objection to war to serve, and so I did. And I went to Morristown, New Jersey, where I worked in a hospital for a number of years. Got my degree in economics from Rutgers University. And then went into New York City and started working in a bank, of all places. Worked with a couple of major international banks as a credit analyst and as a lending officer, and ultimately with ING Barings until 1997 as an investment banker. So that's sort of my background. But all during that time when I was working with the establishment, with the mainstream banking institutions, I kept that in mind, what Dr. Peyton Yoder talked about. So I watched the gold markets. I watched what happened in 1971. I remember very clearly August 15th, 1971, when Richard Nixon removed gold from the international monetary system. And with that, of course, we started to see credit cards, people starting to live beyond their means, and exactly the very things that Dr. Peyton Yoder talked about, I believe, started to become a reality in the lives of America. We started to see people sort of, have the pleasures of life right now without working for them, without saving, and I think it's gotten into an awful lot of trouble. But I started watching that and believing that with the debasement of currency, that gold had to increase its value very substantially. So I, as a young banker, started paying a lot of attention to the gold markets. Of course, we had that huge gold bull market from $35, and when Nixon took us off the gold standard in '71 to $850, January 1980, and it was right after that that I started writing my newsletter, which is now J. Taylor's Gold, Energy, and Tech Stocks. At that time, it was called North American Gold Mining Stocks. But in any event, I kept that going and worked as a banker until 1997, then left and devoted full-time to my newsletter, and then later, more recently, about 5 years ago, started my radio show called Turning Hard Times into Good Times, which can be listened to, as you mentioned, can be accessed through J. Taylor Media or directly at voiceamerica.com. But I keep in touch very much with people in the banking industry, friends of mine that still work there. I keep in touch, though, more with people who are of a hard money orientation, who believe in traditional values, especially on the monetary and economic front. And I guess that's one of the reasons I'm talking to you today, Duncan.
And the types of guests that you typically have on your show focus on what type of topics?
Well, I've had people like on the economic front, like Ron Paul has been on. Mark Faber's been on a number of times. We have just a huge number of people. It's so many of them. It's hard to recall them all. I can go over some of the lists. Adrian Day, Bill Lagner, some establishment people like Dick Beauvais, who many people might know of. They see him on the mainstream media. Doug Casey, Eric Sprott's been on. Frank Holmes has been on. John Perkins, very interesting ex-CIA guy, John Perkins, who wrote a book called Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Ian McAvity, James Turk, Jeff Deist, who is Ron Paul's chief of staff, is a good friend of mine. He's on frequently. Jim Rogers is on. John Hathaway of the Tocqueville Gold Fund is on. So lots and lots of people that are very interesting. Louis Lehrman and Ron Paul together I had on one time. Louis Lehrman was, of course, almost became governor of the state of New York, and was one of two people who was in favor of returning to a gold standard, along with Ron Paul. I had both of them on my radio show together. Rick Rule, Robert Prechter, just lots and lots of people. But I guess the general theme would be basically Austrian school, free market economics. Also do some things with some theologians from time to time. I still believe, I guess it's my roots being brought up in a Christian family, that it is necessary for capitalism to work smoothly and for it to be a productive system, that you have to have some internal controls about that govern how you treat your fellow man.
Right. I've heard it said that if you don't have internal controls, they'll be imposed from without.
I believe that's true, and there are those friends of mine who are atheists and who do not believe in God, who argue that if that we can just have a system that takes care of itself. But then those people, many times, when it comes to self-serving issues, they will forget the rules that they think it should be imposed on everyone else. So I think you need to have some sense that there is a system that you need to abide by, and that system, I believe, was given to us by the Creator of the universe, which is what our founding fathers believed when they issued the Declaration of Independence. So I really firmly believe that until and unless we move back to some sense in the mainstream that there is somebody to answer to other than Obama or Bush or Hitler or Stalin, that that we're not going to have our freedom restored.
So where do you see today the primary distinctions and differences between what you're describing there is a inherently just system based on natural law and the dignity of the individual and that sort of thing, our right relationship with each other and our Creator, but where do you see we are today what clear and present dangers could you help us to walk us through in our current system? Why are things not that way today, specifically in our current economic system?
Yeah, well, I really honestly believe that the big lie that is in the process of destroying America is in the field of evolution. I believe that Darwinian evolution is clearly clearly wrong and is not true. At the same time, I think there are a lot of young Earth Christians that are foolishly denying scientific reality. So I have had one of the people on my radio show that I've had on as a professor, former MIT professor and theologian as well, now lives and teaches in Jerusalem, as well as Dr. Hugh Ross. He's been on my show. He is also an astrophysicist and a Christian. But I think what happened was when the mainstream and all of our institutions have basically convinced most Americans that there is no God, that there was no creator, and that then set the stage for a lot of things. I would say that if we look at the Ten Commandments, for example, that really create social order, that once we've thrown the Ten Commandments out, we've basically provided the framework for chaos, and I think chaos is what we're getting. And I would just point to one of the most obvious commandments among those 10, and that is thou shalt not steal. I think there's no clearer evidence of theft than fiat money. Fiat money is a means by which those who control the system, those who print the money, can redistribute wealth from those that create it. I like to say the miners, the farmers, the manufacturers, the inventors, people that actually do things for other people, create the wealth, and the redistribution from those folks to the people that control the system, namely Washington and Wall Street, I think is so obvious. And with that then comes a growing immorality and abuse of our fellow man. So I would say that to a certain extent, removing gold from the monetary system paved the way for a lot of this, but you could take it back one step further. If you observed that commandment, thou shalt not steal, then you would not have removed gold from the monetary system. But so I think you really have to go back to sort of first principles. What is the truth? How did what is there a creator? And if there is a creator, then what is the order that he's created for us? And you can look at almost all of the Ten Commandments and realize that if we strive to obey those, and none of us can or will do it perfectly for sure, but if we strive to obey those Ten Commandments, then we would treat our fellow man in a way that we would not need Obama, Bush, Hitler, or Stalin to tell us what to do. So I think that's where the problem began, and I think that until we have some sort of restored vision of a supreme being, you call it natural law, until we see that again as our founding fathers did. I mean, I think that's where the vision of our freedom and liberty came from. And it's not to say that America was always perfect. We had a lot of problems. We always did. I mean, I think that's the nature. I think the sinful nature of man means that we are not able really to, without the help of a supreme being and a belief in the supreme being, to govern ourselves. I mean, it was George Washington who said something like, "It is impossible to properly govern a nation without God and the Bible." I mean, that was the first president of the United States. I can't imagine that the one we have now, the presidents in the White House now, would dare say such a thing. And yet I think that goes right back to the very basic foundation of what made us great and what made us free, more importantly.
So what specific examples for people who are kind of still sitting on the fence, or they're still very much accustomed to hearing information coming from modern conventional sources, what are some specific examples that would give them sort of the due diligent underpinnings of understanding that the system has clear and present dangers to them and to their families' well-being now?
Yeah, what I would suggest to people is that they should read a book called The Creature from Jekyll Island, which I think would help people understand that the system isn't what it's pretended to be, what it pretends to be. The system that we have now in America is ruled and controlled by a very small number of very elite and rich and extremely powerful people, and that the system is while I think on the surface it's made to look like it's democratic and people have a say, in fact, they have no say. And so I think that people should read that book. That would be a starting point for me, would be to go to read The Creature from Jekyll Island, because I think it would help them understand and to see that what the mainstream media and the mainstream institutions, our universities, even our churches and so forth, that basically tell people that things are okay, you know, and it's true. You can look around and say, well, you know what? Where would you go that's better than America? And it's hard to find a place. I can't think of any place I'd rather go than right here. But it's the direction of things that are going in the wrong way. And so that would be one place. I would tell people to look at that, because what that shows is that the Federal Reserve was created by a small number of self-serving, extremely rich families, European and U.S. families, and that it was made to control. And ever since the Fed was created, and then the move away from gold, it gave more and more power to those ruling elite, and so that's where I would start with. I mean, we only have to look at what has happened since 1913, and the continued control and the corruption that money plays, and endless amounts of money that's created in the system and is used for campaign contributions and to rule the system. I think that is very obvious to anybody that looks at it, but that would be the starting point I would point people to. And that was a book that as a matter of fact, at the small Mennonite college, high school that I went to, recently was asked by the principal of the school if there was one book I would suggest his seniors read before they leave high school. I told him it would be The Creature from Jekyll Island. And I have had Ed Griffin on my radio show several times in the past.
So bringing that down to the individual household, how does that play out? You talked at a high level, at the big scale of these hyper-rich families who own banks and so on, both in Europe and the United States, forming the Fed for their own purposes and inflating the money supply and so on. What does that do to the individual family? What
it does to the individual family is that it encourages them to have today the pleasures of this life without working for it, and in other words, going into debt. And so what people have done is they've been encouraged. I mean, even the Keynesian economic philosophy, which is probably the second biggest lie that's destroyed America, it encourages people to be patriotic and to go into debt, to spend money and to create demand. And it almost the whole system is basically geared towards indebtedness, and I think it's a system internally that gets families in debt. Look at college kids coming out of school now with huge amounts of debts, and of course the economy has been destroyed by this money printing and deficit spending, and so it impacts individuals by encouraging them to not to live responsibly, and the whole entire economic system. And the Federal Reserve, which is creeping interest rates artificially low, encourages people to continue spending and not to save, and that wrecks lives ultimately. I had John Perkins on my show. I think I mentioned his name earlier, author of Confessions of an Economic Hitman. It was a book that he wrote. He's written several subsequent books in which he talked about how the United States, the modus operandi post-World War II, was really for the United States and these same people that really own and operate the Federal Reserve, for them to go out and indebt third world countries that and once you get them in debt, then you own them. Well, I think that's what the whole system is doing domestically as well. It's getting people in debt, and then when people are in debt, that has puts a lot of strain on families and on the happiness and well-being of families, destroys the families. I would just mention, going back again to the Ten Commandments, those various commandments: honor your father and your mother, and thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not murder, things like that. But I mean, those were commandments that really were very influenced strong families if they are obeyed. And of course, stealing and bearing false witness against other people. I mean, these are all commandments that I think were meant to help us hold things together. But the government essentially steals through the printing press. They create money, and those that are creating it then are redistributing wealth from those families that would be engaged in productive work, that would do things that would actually contribute to the economy. And those people are being their pockets are being picked through this debt system that then causes them to, I think, causes strains on the family. And leads to a lot of heartache and chaos in their lives going forward.
And this describes the exposure to debt and the risks that it brings to any family. In addition to that would be on a household-by-household basis, where people are going through those life struggles of really surrendering their independence and their freedom for that dependency of being on a government dole or being indebted. Do you also, in your personal outlook, see a major society-wide or worldwide collapse or upset of any kind coming in the future? And if so, what do you see that looking like?
Yeah, unfortunately I do. Donegan, I think that we're in big trouble, and actually next week on my radio show I'm going to be talking to a fellow named Dmitry Orlov, who's written a book called Reinventing Collapse, and he is really drawing parallels between what went on in the Soviet Union and what's happening in the United States. I think what happens is, as families and individuals run into trouble and become indebted, and the lifestyles and the conveniences that they expected to have are no longer possible, and as they even have trouble putting food on their table, I think that's really when you start to see revolts and so forth taking place. There was an article that was just passed along to me this morning, in which apparently Obama is making plans to use the U.S. military against the American people. This came from the Washington Times, I believe. It says, "Inside the ring, directive outlines Obama's plan to use military against citizens." And I think they're planning. I think that the ruling elite sees the handwriting on the walls, and I think they're gearing up for something like martial law. Nobody knows when this is going to happen, but it seems to me clear the U.S. economy is getting worse and worse and worse. The mainstream media paints a different picture. They try to tell us things are pretty good. They want to keep us conned into continue to spend and go into debt further and further. But the government is really sort of tightening the noose around our necks in more and more ways. I see another article in the Financial Times today by Kenneth Rogoff. He's saying paper money is unfit for a world of high crime and low inflation. So I think the ruling elite and the people that come out of the main universities like Rogoff are really suggesting that government needs more and more power and more control over our lives. And I don't really know, what the answer is to that. I don't think there is an answer. I said earlier, I think that has to happen is that there has to be a change in the way people view their worldview, that there has to be a belief in a creator and somebody bigger than Obama, Bush, Hitler, or Stalin. So I think, though, that what we have to do is try to counter what the pressures of the mainstream are. They would have us go into debt. We should rid ourselves of debt. They would have us use paper money. We should get rid of our paper money and buy money with intrinsic value and exchange it for money. Take the paper while it still has. While others are still conned into believing it has value, switch that paper for gold and silver because it does have intrinsic value, and we're seeing other parts of the world that are valuing gold and silver. China, Russia, the BRIC countries as a whole, I think are moving towards a monetary system that is an honest monetary system, and I suppose at some point in time when it becomes understood globally that the United States dollar is a complete fraud, that there will be a tanking of the dollar, and in which case it will be virtually worthless. And then I think we could have some very, very severe problems of civil unrest and very possibly martial law. I'm afraid that is very much a possibility, and we Americans aren't used to that sort of thing. I think other people in other nations around the world have seen in their recent histories this kind of government tyranny and so they are not as trusting of government, and actually in some ways more attuned to free market capitalism than we are. We've sort of become, I think, slowly, like the frog being cooked in the kettle, have slowly sort of been turned into servants of the state without us even realizing it. We're promised freebies, and we say, "Oh, that sounds good. Let's go for it." And in the meantime, we're giving up our freedom and our liberty. But I do believe there definitely are issues that we're going to have to deal with. And ultimately, Donegan, it's I think it was the psalmist that said we live 70 years and 80 if we're strong, and then we go to the home of our ancestors. So I think ultimately, as a guy who's a lot older than you, I give this some more thought than I did when I was 20 or 30, that the days are numbered, and so we do have to ultimately think in those terms too. What is really precious in life is our family, people close to us. We need to love them, care for them while we have time on earth, and that means, I think, doing the things that we need to do, like being responsible with our finances, save our money, exchange this fraudulent stuff for real money, gold and silver, and for tangible assets that have some value. We can't do anything about when governments come in and rape and pillage their citizens. That's more common in history than not, and our founding fathers understood that. Unfortunately, Americans don't know that. They don't realize that the government can be the biggest enemy of all of us. And so I think what we also need to do is just do what you're doing on your show and what I do, and that's to talk about these things and truthfully and honestly, without hype, let people know what is really going on.
Now, you've got a special position there in living in a large metropolitan area. A number of our guests have talked about the advantages if people wanted to move out of metropolitan areas into a very low population density area to be farther removed from potential societal unrest should there be a systemic collapse in the future. But I wondered if we could just get your personal reflections, since you are in a very large metro area, of what you think are prudent ways. You've mentioned some principles that would be, people could practice regardless of where they live, as far as getting out of debt and owning real assets. But what other considerations should people consider if they really are living in a large metropolitan area, as far as increasing the safety of their families?
Yeah, this is something that my wife and I talk about frequently. We live in ground zero, essentially, in New York City. I can't think of, besides Washington, any other place that might be more problematic. Moving to Idaho or someplace like that has its appeal. And I suppose that is something that we think of doing. Living here, I think that you do what you can by having some precious metals, if you can find a safe place to keep them. You want to have as much as possible food and water, things like that. I personally don't own a firearm. I never have. I have nothing. I think people should be free to own firearms. In New York City, it's very difficult to own them, I think probably because the state wants to be able to have a cakewalk when they want to take over us and subdue us. But, I don't think there's a lot that people can do other than, if you live in a metropolitan area, is to have those things that you need. You should have food and water and backup energy sources if possible, with or without the kind of chaotic government situation we're talking about. We had a hurricane here in New York a couple of years ago, and having backup energy was very valuable for some people. We personally didn't have a problem where we were in a sort of a higher elevation in Queens, but a lot of people did. So those are some of the things you can do. And then I think ultimately you just have to leave it in the hands of the Almighty. I think we do what we can prudently to protect ourselves and our families. We save. We we own hard assets, and we're good to people. I think one of the things that I didn't mention that is very important in an urban area is make friends around you. Learn to know your neighbors and be supportive of them, and help them and then I think you build up a network of friends that can really be of help to one another in times of stress.
Yeah, that principle of just establishing a support network is universal. I've heard that described both in the urban and suburban and rural settings. Is that there's nothing that replaces the strength that comes from having the resilience of different people with different skill sets, different knowledge, different assets that they may have accumulated that they can support each other through tough times. Even from a physical security standpoint, it's just tough to go it alone.
Sure.
So that makes sense in any environment.
Yeah, and I might just mention, I know I really asked Ron Paul that question one time when he was on, and he said, not necessarily in terms of that kind of an emergency that we're talking about, but just in general that people should build up their skill sets, so they can do practical things. I mean, I've been a banker, a newsletter writer, a talk show host, and a lot of other things, but I've never really been very good at fixing toilets or plumbing systems or electrical systems and things like that. So I think whatever you can learn, practical skills makes a lot of sense too, in terms of being a part of this network and having something to offer in exchange for other life-saving services that can be provided.
Well, Jay Taylor, if there's anything else that you have that you could share with as a parting thought for our reluctant prepper audience, or in addition to that, how they can reach you online and get further information from you.
Yeah, I like the name of your show, Reluctant Preppers, because I think all of us are reluctant to look at the problems that we talked about today. I think 99% of Americans just don't want to go there. It's too unpleasant to think about.
Right.
But I think what we're doing is very, very important. What you're doing, I think that we have to stick together, work together, and tell the truth. I think we have to be searching for the truth without hype. And that's what I try to do. And again, it's jtaylormedia.com is the best place to go to follow everything I do. I also do follow a lot of mining companies and look at mining shares. And my newsletter talks about those companies that I think have a good chance of doing extremely well. I do, on a more optimistic note, think that we are going to see a very major rise in the price of gold as denominated in U.S. dollars, and I think that mining companies have a chance, notwithstanding a couple of pretty poor years that we've had, to really create a lot of wealth for people that own shares in companies that are able to produce gold efficiently and economically.
Well, Jay, thanks so much for taking the time to be with us. We'd love to have you back again. You've got so many guests that come through and give you so many different sources of information, different perspectives to look at things that you could come and share it with our reluctant prepper audience. We'd love to have you back again.
Thank you, Donegan. It's been a pleasure.